welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland. My name's Kenny McBride, and I'm joined today by two esteemed guests. Firstly, by Professor Alison Phipps, and then by Richard Thomson, the SNP MP for Gordon. How are you both this morning?
Very well, thank you. How are you, Kenny? And happy Easter to you. And to you, Richard.
Happy Easter to both of you.
I'm doing fine, thanks, Kenny.
Grand.
Happy Easter to you too.
Well, we start today with our statistics update, first of all. A total of 29,903 people in Scotland have been tested for coronavirus up to now. 24,313 of those were negative, 5,590 tests were positive, and 542 patients who tested positive have sadly died. 212 patients were in intensive care in Scotland last night, and there were 1,855 people in Scottish hospitals either confirmed or suspected to have the COVID-19 infection. So, I mean, these numbers just keep rising. Obviously, we will keep an eye on those. But the big news today, obviously, is that our saviour has risen. Boris Johnson got out of bed, we've heard. This has been the big news as far as all of our media are concerned, not these record numbers of deaths across the whole UK. I'll come to you first, Richard. How happy are you to hear that Boris Johnson is able to sit up in bed and watch films and play games, as we've been told he's doing?
Well, I'm pleased that anyone that has been afflicted by this virus is recovering. And while I'm personally very happy for the Prime Minister, personally I'm very, very happy for everybody else that finds themselves recovering. And equally, you know, every death from this is a tragedy. In our own household this week, we've been in lockdown. My partner has been, we think, affected by it. So she's done her 7 days, you know, in solitary confinement, more or less. And it was quite emotional this morning. Today was the first day that, you know, we, in line with the government advice, you know, the kids were able to hug her even. Mm-hmm. So, you know, this is having an absolute impact on everyone, that, you know, whether you have it, whether you think you have it, or whether you're just fearful of having it. So, well, I'm personally happy for the Prime Minister that he's on the mend. You know, thoughts have to be with those who sadly aren't in that position.
Absolutely. And how is your wife now? Is she feeling better?
Yeah, I'm back getting a row about the state of the kitchen and everything like that. So I think normal service is on its way to being resumed.
Well, excellent news. And Alison, I mean, we kind of joke a wee bit about this, but there has been a level of sycophancy in parts of the British media over Boris Johnson's illness. Clearly, obviously, we don't want the Prime Minister to die in the middle of a crisis. But some of the language that's been used about him has been fairly over the top, hasn't it?
I mean, I think the language used right across the piece for how we speak about the coronavirus, the infection, the state of emergency that we're in at the moment, is ripe for interrogation. There was an absolutely excellent piece written by Marina Hyde, all about the way in which we've used battle metaphors and re-invoked the spirit of World War II to discuss this, that we're trying to talk about this as if, you know, we're dealing with a bunch of plucky troops who might go into battle regardless. And yet what we're seeing here are people who are ill-equipped to treat patients. What we're seeing here are leaders who are very good at leading campaigns for political power, often on what are still under investigation as potentially criminal lies, and who really are proving themselves to be ill-equipped to lead a country through a crisis. And to me, this is a story that journalism needs to be looking at, and what we need to be holding to account. So for every single patient who has not recovered from this, for every single person still in intensive care and being treated, there are major questions that we need asked in this country, and we need them asked by our MPs first and foremost in Parliament, and we need them asked by the estate that is the press. And to me, that's the really important story. It is very good news that the Prime Minister is recovering. And I think it's also good news that he's obviously doing the kinds of things that you would want absolutely everyone to be able to do in a state of recovery. Taking it steady, maybe watching a couple of films, maybe playing some games. Those are the sorts of things that are good to do when you're recovering from a serious bout of time in hospital. But everybody needs to be able to do that. And many people are still feeling a great deal of pressure because of the way that income and resource are so criminally unequally distributed across society.
Yeah, and what do you make of the kind of attitude that this'll engender towards him? Do you get the feeling that perhaps the media will go a bit harder on him once he is back in the job full time, or do you suspect that this has bought him a kind of immunity from criticism for a while?
I mean, my feeling is that we are seeing a great deal of spin and an attempt to blame the public. We're seeing an attempt to blame various providers of services. We're seeing attempts to blame the civil service. We're seeing many attempts within government to point a finger of blame rather than actually for Parliament to be held to account and for the government in particular to be held to account. It is quite clear when we look comparatively at other countries in the world that the UK's record is negligent, and that there will be and needs to be a public inquiry as to what has happened. But also there are vital decisions that would be good decisions to take next. And we need accountability around who is taking those decisions, how they are taking those decisions, and the grounds upon which these decisions are based. What is the scientific evidence that is being used? How well tested is this? How well equipped are we to be making the decisions that are being taken at the moment? Some really clear questions need to be asked at the moment. And I think there was a very good piece by Alistair Campbell, who Danny Garavelli has just been quoting in The Scotsman, and she referred to him rather well, I thought, as the poacher turned gamekeeper, but who has said these are 20 questions that the press should be asking at the moment. And this is coming from somebody who has been a past master at deflecting media briefings or deflecting press questions whilst his own Prime Minister was in power when he was working under Tony Blair. So I think there's something really important here about looking at the role the press can play, but also importantly, and this is obviously one for you, Richard, for the kinds of roles that our elected parliamentarians can be playing during a national crisis to make sure we are having daily accountability for those who are making decisions about all of our lives.
Yeah, and Richard, I was just going to come to you on that. The politics of this, obviously, parties tend not to want to get into a lot of political sniping during a major crisis like this. But what role will Parliament be taking, and what do you think? What pressure can be applied to Boris Johnson and his government when Parliament does reconvene?
I think the main form of pressure that Parliament can put on is the ability to mount that sustained questioning that we haven't up until now been seeing at some of the press conferences. There is the ability that MPs, I've worked in the Westminster Parliament a number of years ago for the SNP, but one thing that I'm learning now that I sit in the chamber is the way that MPs can sometimes hunt in packs on a minister, and if they're not happy with a question that they get, that they'll follow up, and sometimes that happens from the government's own side as well as from the opposition. Now, in the recess for Westminster was brought forward because there were worries about whether or not MPs would be infected and whether we'd then go and spread that back to our constituencies. In our final week, we were trying to observe social distancing measures as best we could in the chamber. But I think that sustained questioning is what we can do. But in the week beforehand, the preoccupation was with getting the coronavirus bill passed, which allowed for the social distancing, the lockdown measures to be put in place. We also had the contingencies bill to make the money available to try and put in place some of the measures that have been taken to stave off the economic impact. Now, as a sitting at home, I've not been sitting with my feet up or just looking after the kids over the recess. I've been trying to deal with a number of inquiries from my constituents who've been stranded overseas, who run businesses, who are self-employed, who either aren't getting enough support or who've been completely missed by the package that the Chancellor's got. So there'll be some very, very close questions of detail in terms of aspects of the response. But I think the biggest response is in the where are we now and the what next. And it's that kind of sustained questioning that when Parliament returns, and I see there are moves to try and bring Parliament back just a little bit earlier, to recall it. It's when Parliament comes back, that is where Parliament will come into its own. But the Westminster Parliament has to change in a number of the ways that it's working. I mean, we've already seen an announcement from the Speaker that not everybody that's there will be crushed into the lobby to vote at the same time. Believe it or not, we all have to go through a door and walk through a corridor and be counted through like sheep. Every time we want to cast a vote. We could vote at Aberdeenshire Council or the Scottish Parliament, about 10 or 15 times in the time it takes to do one vote in Westminster. There'll need to be social distancing. I think electronic voting is something which its time has come at Westminster. We'll see more and more video questioning, video conferencing for the select committees, perhaps even for the plenary sessions in the Parliament as well. But we're going to have to find new ways of putting that pressure on. But to come back to it, will be that repeated, sustained questioning and putting ministers on the spot for lengthy periods at a time and being able to do so on a daily basis. That will be where Parliament comes into its own.
Yeah, and just as you can see on screen just now, folks, if you are wanting to get involved in this discussion yourself, you can join us on Twitter. You can follow us, first of all, at Broadcast Scot, and then you can join us in the discussion today by using the hashtag #FoolScottish. But Richard, just to come back to you again, there are, of course, other parties in Westminster who I'm sure will all have something to say. Keir Starmer has just taken up the leadership of the Labour Party. What do you expect, Keir Starmer specifically, but the other parties, what do you expect them to be doing in Parliament as when you do get back to it?
Well, I think we've now had we've had some time to draw breath and reflect on where the response has come. I think Keir Starmer will be determined to try and establish his credentials as a Prime Minister in waiting. So I think he will try and be measured and forensic in his questioning, as you'd expect a former Director of Public Prosecutions in England to do. I think he's somebody that's, even if you don't necessarily like all of his politics or his approach to Scotland or the way that he's bounced into some of his positions in Scotland, I think you can see in him he's somebody with intellect and ability, and it remains to be seen how well he can take the Labour Party with him in the direction he wants to go. The Liberals are still kind of, they're still leaderless and rudderless at the moment. I think they're still finding it difficult to adjust to the fact that they're not the third party. So, there are some decent MPs amongst the Liberal contingent, all small as it is. So, I expect to see some flashes from them periodically. Caroline Lucas of the Greens has become an extremely effective parliamentarian, but also we're not short of ability on the SNP benches, as was shown over the last two parliaments. And Ian Blackford in particular has been very effective at holding the Prime Minister to account. Joanna Cherry, as you'd expect of a QC, is always very effective in terms of her questioning and getting down to the nub of the real issue. Philippa Whitford has been exceptional in terms of her approach to scrutinising over Europe and also in the coronavirus and the medical response. And of course, we've got our fresh intake of MPs like myself who are finding our feet and looking to make our mark for our constituents. So again, I think there are a lot of people who feel they have something to prove, and we're in a situation where I think that open, sceptical minds, this is a time for them to assert themselves and to use the skills that got them to Parliament in the first place. And certainly when Parliament comes back, I would fully expect I and my colleagues to be doing exactly that.
And now, to come back to you, Alison, the British government has had some warning about this. Back in October of 2016, there was an exercise called Exercise Cygnus, a 3-day training on how to deal with a pandemic. This was a kind of stress test of the whole system, the NHS, local authorities, the government departments, all kind of trying to work out how a pandemic might play out. And we now find out the results of that were never published because it was deemed too terrifying to be revealed to the public. Now there's a whole string of events in the recent and not so recent past that have raised concerns about how prepared Britain was for this kind of event. What do you think about the state the state of preparedness and the state of planning that we appear to have had for an event like this?
Yeah, I mean, there are no dress rehearsals for something like this, are there? There are times in history, in human history, where we've experienced plague. There have been other pandemics, and I've certainly recently been speaking with a number of folk who were very involved in the height of the AIDS pandemic, and there was no preparedness. There was an awful lot of denial. There was a lot of scapegoating of people. I think it's very easy as well for people who are kind of armchair experts who have Twitter and Facebook and news feeds at their fingertips to think that they know what the answers are. And I do think that anybody in a position of leadership has an extraordinarily difficult job to do in a crisis. Some of the best advice I was given during what is called the refugee crisis, the crisis of hospitality and the closing of borders in Europe in 2015, when I found myself in leadership positions and needing to lead through and in a crisis, was that 80% of your decisions maximum will be good decisions. You cannot do better in a crisis. And that you need to be forgiving of yourself and hope that others will be forgiving of you for the 20%. And that you'll then be working through what the fallout is from the decisions that you've taken. And that actually perhaps the most catastrophic thing you can do is wait to try and get it right, because there are no dress rehearsals. There are no other possible avenues. You have to make a decision to close things down or not. And you have to do it on time. And I think we're seeing the graphs, and we're seeing people just glued to these curves, trying to make sense of what these numbers are, because the numbers aren't really telling us the stories. And we have got a sense of, countries who have learned very quickly, who were prepared, and who made decisions. And it's not so much whether they were prepared to do it, but whether they were prepared to take the decisions and then deal with the next present, and to take then the next best decision possible and to deal with that present, and then the next best decision possible and deal with that present. So I think we can put a lot of focus on what we might have done to mitigate what might have happened, but when you're actually in the thick of it, it's about taking each next step with the best advice you can get, and then taking the next best step with the best advice you can get. And I think really a lot of scrutiny is needed of the kinds of advice that were given, the ways in which it was used ideologically and politically, and the ways in which it was based upon science. And I think that's the sort of thing that will come out retrospectively in the UK. But we're seeing countries like New Zealand and Germany and South Korea with very different sets of statistics. We're seeing a number of the countries which are particularly led by women leaders who have acted very quickly to lock things down, and where you're not seeing the same death rates. And it's almost as though we're seeing a kind of real-time comparison that allows us to look back and say, not so much how good was our preparedness, though that is a big part of it, but also how good was our decision making in the light of the evidence. How well practiced were we at taking expertise seriously? And what we do know in the UK is that for the last 5 or 6 years, expertise, particularly scientific expertise, the expertise of people like myself who are paid by the government to be experts, to research and think deeply about things in society, that has been maligned and has been dismissed and has been replaced with an awful lot of things which we are now finding are not strong enough for us to stake our lives on.
Yeah, Alison, you mentioned there these women leaders, places like Iceland and New Zealand have had really, really quick and effective responses. What do you think lies behind that? Is that just a coincidence, or do you think there is something about having women in leadership positions that has made a real difference?
I would really want to say leadership always depends on the people in power, and that it isn't primarily a question of gender, but gender does make a difference. There is an element of gendering which is about the gendering of care and of empathy. And whilst not every female leader who we have had has necessarily demonstrated these characteristics, particularly not in our own country, we do have women who have led with compassion and kindness and humour. And when we watch the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, we see her actually taking time in her briefings to announce to the children of New Zealand that although they will be very busy and may have other things to do, and the way in which they behave may not be the same as normal, the Tooth Fairy and the Easter Bunny are key workers. Now, that's leadership. That's leadership for everybody in society. That's leadership for children, for parents. That's getting parents off the hook, but also giving them a way of being creative. And that's a leader who says, the children of this country matter to me. And it's a really beautiful thing to observe it. And I do think that the way in which the emotional labour of the work of dealing with what it's like to be in lockdown is largely undertaken by women, not just women alone, but largely undertaken by women, as emotional labour in society is. It's women who are juggling and thinking about the household, because it's women who've been put in positions where that has been the expectation, the gendered expectation and the practice for millennia. And so you're seeing this coming to the fore. And I particularly have been speaking to many of my own postgraduate students who are absolutely furious that it's their studies that are being put on hold because they have a key worker in their household and they're having to do all the childcare, all the provisioning, all the thinking, all the emotional labour, so that the key worker can do the key work. And their work, their labour, that they feel is so hard won, cannot be honoured at this time. It's only at this time that it can't be honoured, but there are so many questions about gender that are part of the revelation of the inequalities that are still the basis of our society in the UK.
Yeah, absolutely. That's something that we've been bringing up on the show for weeks now. Is the way that as a society we undervalue so many of what we're now referring to as the essential workers.
Absolutely.
Whether that's traditionally kind of important workers, people like healthcare workers, or whether it's people working in shops who are doing a vital job that we really don't appreciate well enough. Richard, to come back to you, we, as Alison said, the big thing in a pandemic is to act quickly. It's one of the things the World Health Organization has said is act quickly, worry about whether you made the right decision later, because whatever you do is going to be better than doing nothing. And yet the UK does seem at several points to have done very little when there were options to do something. I saw a series of tweets this morning comparing the Irish response to the British response. While they were cancelling St. Patrick's Day, we were still hosting the Cheltenham Festival. And all these, we had this, we had the Prime Minister talking about going into hospital and shaking hands with everybody, even as we were telling people that they needed to wash their hands a lot more. What do you think of the British level of preparedness and how that sort of fast reactions, how those decisions have been made?
Well, I'd like to come back to something Alison said, and I think it's really, really important, and it is about the quality of the leadership and the not so much about the preparedness, about how much of the essential equipment you had in a warehouse somewhere, but about how you were prepared to react, and some of the thought processes and the skill sets that were there. And I think Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand's a great example. Nicola Sturgeon's a great example of leaders that have responded empathetically. They've communicated clearly. They've listened to the expert advice. They've shared the stage. They've allowed the expertise to come to the fore. And I think that the responses in these countries seem to have been better. And I think it's something. Yes, it's about the character of those individuals, but it's also about the manner in which you conduct the politics in the parliaments where those individuals emerge. And I think that where you do have that more consensual collegiate approach, you tend to find better leaders who are better equipped to respond as we would like. I think the trouble with the British response is that there is that kind of British fetishisation of the strong ruler who bestrides the country like a colossus and sees off the uppity foreigners, and has this belief in British exceptionalism, and employs that sort of rhetoric and then gets lauded for it in the press and by parts of the public at large. I think to a large extent, to begin with at least, there was this sense of British exceptionalism that, well, if it does reach our shores, we'll deal with it quickly. We don't need to do what the Irish are doing or what anybody else in Europe is doing. We'll fight this on the beaches. And it's almost this sort of myth of the superhuman that's currently, in Whitehall, that in government, and particularly amongst the advisors. You see it with Dominic Cummings, that it's almost as if they believe themselves to be superior to all others, that the only lives that matter are theirs and those like them, that if you're poor, if you're economically marginalised, somehow that's some kind of failure of moral failure or failure of effort. And there's been a complete and utter disdain for the contribution of experts. We've seen that throughout Brexit, but also there has been this sense that your worth to society is determined solely by the bottom line in your pay packet. And we're finding out who really matters at this time. Over the last few weeks, nobody has missed the stockbrokers. Nobody's missed the merchant bankers. But my goodness, what a mess would be in if it wasn't for the doctors, the nurses, the people who are keeping the hospital wards clean. Let me say a word here for the social care workers who are going in and looking after folk in care homes, sometimes without all the equipment that they need, depending on where they are. So I think that there has to be a reappraisal at the highest level. I mean, I've always voted for a well-funded set of public services to make sure that people are valued. Lots of people in Scotland have taken that same view. But as a society, whether that's in Scotland or at UK level, we need to be making absolutely sure that at the end of this, we've taken a very, very long, hard, cold look at who it is that we actually do rely on in society, and that if we are all in this together, then we need to be tackling properly, not just talking about it, but seriously tackling some of all of the inequalities that we've seen, whether that's economic or whether it's gender-based. If we're going to have anything positive coming out of this, maybe it will be people realising that we're not exceptional. We are not, after all, masters of the universe. In the face of nature, we're really quite insignificant. And that actually we are all in this together, and we need to make sure that everybody is getting a fairer share of what it is that we're able to produce.
Yeah, and do you get the sense that maybe coming out of this, we might see a change in that style of leadership, that kind of Britishness that we've got used to from those leaders? Do you get the suspicion that maybe Boris Johnson will come out of hospital humbled and with a new appreciation of the NHS that might kind of change how the political face of Britain looks for a while?
I've no doubt he will be personally exceptionally grateful for the care that he's received. He will say that, and he'll genuinely mean it. The question is how that feeds through to the policy choices that are then made, and that's where I think that will fall down. Yeah.
Well, we will obviously wish him the best. He's, as we said, he is up on his feet. He's been able to get up and walk about, so clearly he's recovering well. We do wish him well. It's the sooner he can get back to his desk and start answering those questions we were talking about, the better, I think. But we will move on. And we're looking at the rest of Europe for a bit. And Alison, I wanted to come to you first because this does obviously connect back to the UK. Priti Patel has refused to take children in from the Greek refugee camps, where clearly COVID-19 is becoming a serious problem anywhere where there are large numbers of people congregated in less than perfectly sanitary conditions. These problems are going to arise. What do you make of this decision by Priti Patel?
Well, it's entirely consistent with the way in which the Home Office has been behaving for at least the last 10 years. It is callous, it's cruel, and it isn't respecting the human rights of the people in those camps. It isn't respecting particularly Article 3 and the articles which allow people to seek asylum, claim asylum, and be offered sanctuary and refuge. And I think it's just really important to go back to the science. You know, it is very clear that closing borders has not made and doesn't make the difference. Testing people makes the difference. Testing is what Dr. Tedros said we needed to be doing from the World Health Organization, so that at borders people are put into quarantine when they travel, but it is not people themselves, whether they are refugees or whether they are elite travelers, that in that sense are the problem. Once the virus is within a country, it's testing and containing that is important. And the virus, as we know, is in pretty much every country in the world now. The situation in the camps in Europe, which should never ever existed in the first place, be it those that were in Calais were then dispersed and then reformed around the Pas-de-Calais area, where I was with Anne McLaughlin, Joanna Cherry, Angela Crawley, and with Stuart MacDonald before about 4 years ago at Easter this time, just seeing for ourselves what an absolute scandal those places were, what a stain on the conscience of Europe it was that we were in a situation where we were seeing a civil society effort to make sure that people were given absolute basic requirements. I'm working with Médecins Sans Frontières in France, as well as all of the organisations set up from the UK, who were just trying to make sure people had their basic human needs and basic dignity given. And we see at the moment that is being refused to unaccompanied minors and to people seeking refuge in the camps of Europe. And this is it beggars belief, really. I am so regularly lost for words when I see the actions of the Home Office and the decisions that it takes vis-à-vis refugees and asylum seekers. And what I am then seeing is that it is absolutely true that the way we treat and have treated the least amongst us is precisely the way that is practiced for treating others. So the fact that there isn't sufficient PPE equipment, the fact that people are working horrendous shifts, the fact that our NHS is so horrifically under-resourced and understaffed at this moment in time, all of that is part and parcel of the same sets of decision-making which have been sustained over many years and which we need to hold to account. The situation for refugees is absolutely catastrophic. The situation for people in the global south is catastrophic. I am on a regular Zoom and Skype calls with colleagues in the Gaza Strip who have lived under siege for the last 15 years. There are no more testing kits available. There's one hospital, it's very poorly resourced. If the virus gets in, there are 2.2 million people who are extremely exposed, and many of those are refugees and have been refugees for generations. Similarly, the conversations and the discussions and the phone calls I'm having with partners and colleagues in Zimbabwe, who we're working with at the moment from the University of Glasgow, who are basically saying, at the end of the day in Zimbabwe, it's between me and my immune system. There is nothing else. That we live in a world where the international community has actively fostered this situation so that the poorest amongst us, those with the least resources, are so hideously exposed. That lies, yes, at the door of the Home Office and at the door of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and our International Development and Aid Aid Department. And there is so much reckoning that needs to be done in order for us to live once again in a world where we use the international instruments, the United Nations, the World Health Organization, UNESCO, to ensure that good scientific education, good cultural communication, good health care and provision and social security are available for everyone so that all might live in dignity and with their rights intact. And it's human rights that I'm seeing very much as being the casualties in this situation at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, to change the topic very slightly, Richard, and I'd still like to hear your comments on what Alison had to say, but we are seeing some changes happening across Europe. Spain is apparently set to lift some restrictions on manufacturing and construction on Monday, which is, I think, a lot sooner than some people were expecting some of these restrictions to start being lifted. At the same time, we're hearing that the EU itself, particularly its financial institutions, are coming under a lot of strain just now. When you look at Europe just now, how do you see Europe kind of either coming together or pulling apart as a result of this crisis?
That's a tough one. I mean, I think what this shows, if anything, is that no country countries can act in isolation, but we're all affected by the actions of each other. There are some things that are absolutely no respecters of borders. Now, I think that Europe is financially strong. It will genuinely be able to do whatever it takes, and I think there is enough social solidarity there that will be what happens. In terms of loosening some of the restrictions that are there, I think that obviously has to be backed up by the science. Now, I'm not familiar enough with the rates of infection in Spain. It's hard enough keeping track with what's going on here. But before anything like that were to happen here, I would want to be reassured that the curve had been flattened, that the virus, the rate of infection was in retreat, and that we were monitoring adequately the rates of infection going forward, so that we were ready, if need be, to move towards a more restricted situation again, if that was required. But that can't be done by politicians based on newspaper editorials or Twitter feeds or what the opinion pollsters tell them. I think that is one where we have to take the best politicians have to take the best scientific guidance that there is and then to act upon it. But I don't think it takes Europe apart. If anything, I think it shows the value of collective action. I think one of the most striking elements of that was the way that Europe tried to procure PPE equipment in bulk as part of a big order, and offered the UK the opportunity to be a part of that. And then miraculously, the UK said, apparently refused that, saying, no, we've left the European Union, we don't need to be a part of that. And when they were called out on it, then it was, the blame was being shunted down, we didn't see the email. And Alistair Campbell described that as the dog ate my homework type of excuse. I don't think that in the face of a pandemic like this, you have to take the actions within the borders of your own jurisdiction, obviously. But if something like this doesn't make you aware of how the international community fits together and the value of collective action beyond borders, then I'm not entirely certain what would.
Yeah, and speaking of international leadership and people making wrong decisions, we turn now to the US, where we're now seeing around about 2,000 deaths every day. By far the worst hit area is New York City, but clearly the rest of the country has seen huge surges in infections. Most states now are locked down pretty well, but there's still a lot of problems there, very similar to the problems we're experiencing here: lack of protective equipment, lack of ability to respond. Richard, coming to you, what do you make of the American response to this, and in comparison, particularly with how Britain has handled this? Do you see any similarities between the two?
To some extent. I mean, I think the furthest I'll go on this at this point is that at the outset, both had leaders at the highest level, in terms of the Prime Minister and the President, who did not seem to fully appreciate the significance of what was likely to come. And I'll pause there for now in terms of the comparison. But certainly, I think the leadership at the highest level in the United States has been woeful. on this, absolutely woeful. And I think that the way that it was played down, the mixed messaging, the way that part of leadership is leading by example, the way that the present incumbent of the Oval Office, when the guidance was that it would be better to wear face masks, said, well, yeah, you guys can do that, but I'm not going to do that. I don't think it really fits with my image as a president. Whatever guidance you're giving, you need to be making sure that you're following yourselves. We've got we had a high-profile casualty of that ourselves in Scotland last week. But I think that the leadership at the highest level in the United States has been woeful. And again, I think it comes down to the lack of willingness to listen to experts that are telling you things that you don't necessarily want to hear, and also the lack of a culture whereby political decisions or thought processes can be challenged effectively. It seems in this White House that if you challenge a decision of the president or the thought process of the president, then you're out. And that's not a way to have a healthy debate or to get the best possible decisions. And it's certainly no way to change course, because you just reinforce the groupthink that tends to exist in organisations anyway. So I think, I feel for those who are trying on the front line in the United States to tackle this. I feel for those at state level who are trying to do this without having had an adequate federal response, because if there was one country that was equipped to deal with this quickly in terms of the federal powers it has and the muscle it has and the manufacturing capability at its disposal, it was the United States of America. But at the end of it, at the federal level, that political strength will not have been deployed. It will be a failure. And again, we'll see the grotesque inequalities come to the fore, whereby those who can afford medical insurance will get access to the best treatment that their policies will let them, and many, many others will not. And again, we'll see exactly who the haves and the have-nots. And again, that burden will fall particularly, I think, on the ethnic minorities in America, who often find themselves at the margins of society, economically and socially. So this was a chance for America to really step up. But I think the US has been badly let down by the president and those he's surrounded himself with.
Yeah. And Alison, we've talked on the show numerous times about the way that some countries, a lot of countries around the world recently have been moving into more sort of isolationist, more nationalist positions. Do you get any sense that we might kind of come to value the international institutions that we have, things like the World Health Organization, things like the UN, the EU? Do you think we might now see just how interdependent the world is and start to value those institutions a bit more?
I actually think that those who trusted those institutions to start with will probably continue to do so, and those who didn't will probably continue not to. Those who thought that they were overly bureaucratic, overweening, and a waste of money will continue to preach that line. And those who honestly believe that intercultural and international cooperation and an understanding of how we live in diversity will want that to continue to be part of our lives. But just to maybe just give you one example of my own work at the moment, and nearly everything I do has had to stop. Most of my work is speaking in public to large groups of people, leading workshops around integration and around particularly integration of migrants, enabling people to speak and learn other languages and to use other cultural artifacts and live well in other cultures. It's highly physical work, even though I'm an intellectual, obviously, person who works with my mind. And at the moment, I'm working on projects which are looking at migration and movement. And of course, that movement has stopped. Apart from, and I'm just going to let you know, my little granddaughter who's about to come into my room is an example of she's a UK citizen, but also born to migrant parents. So just wandering through, bye, Sienna. Yeah. And she, but I think, migration has stopped. The planes have stopped. The boats have stopped. Largely, people are not moving. We're not moving very far. We're just moving on foot. Police are stopping cars. and asking where people are going in this country. So all of these questions of which boundaries we cross and how and why are being reset radically. We're all into a new situation of thinking about the borders of our home and our lives, the borders of our body as being placed in a different way. And that will lead to new ways of living, new ways of understanding our lives, and that will need people to think carefully about it. Rebecca Solnit had an absolutely superb piece in The Guardian this week, the long read, entitled "The Impossible Has Already Happened: What Coronavirus Can Teach Us About Hope." And in it, she said that one of our main tasks now, especially those of us who are not sick, are not frontline workers and not dealing with other economic or housing difficulties, is to understand this moment, what it might require of us and what it might make possible. And I am finding myself, and I was speaking with a colleague yesterday, I'm finding myself highly stimulated intellectually by the situation we're in, thinking very hard indeed about what this might mean for human behavior, human development, human cultural interaction, what kinds of changes are already in place. Because the one thing we know, and I know as an anthropologist, is that human beings are radically adaptable. So what our new international institutions will look like, what our universities will look like in future, all of this at the moment is unknowable. And anybody who says to me they know what the future is going to look like, and anyone who's making predictions, to me, is really not to be trusted at this moment in time. We don't know because we haven't yet started to make it. We haven't started to make a future. Right now, we just need to survive and take care of one another.
Yeah. Now, Richard, I just wanted to come to you quite quickly. The Scottish Government, for the most part, has been part of this Four Nations strategy, so-called, with England, Wales and Northern Ireland. Now, obviously, there are some issues where that makes a lot of sense. There are some issues where we are one island or one kind of cluster of islands. Mm-hmm. We are so there are things where it makes sense to do that. What's been your feeling about that more generally? Do you think Scotland could have benefited from maybe diverging a little bit sooner from that UK-wide approach?
I think an awful lot of this will come out in the wash when we see who was advised what when. But I think generally speaking, the Scottish Government has acted proportionately, appropriately, so far as I can tell, and it's communicated that well. And those are the things I think that most people would say about the response. I think we want to be careful about those who would play constitutional politics around this. And I think one of the more egregious examples we've seen of that has been in terms of the way the business support package have diverged in Scotland and in England, and the way that the Conservatives have tried to make a bit of capital, pretty unseemly, in a pretty unseemly way round about that. Now, in some ways, because we're part of the United Kingdom at the moment, although I wish we weren't, obviously, as a supporter of independence, we're still hidebound by the fact that we've got limited borrowing powers, limited tax and economic powers. So in terms of how we're funding the response, that is still dependent on decisions that are taken at Westminster in terms of English expenditure, which then might have a knock-on effect in Scotland, rather than us being able to say, right, this is the resource at our disposal and this is what we would like to do with it. That's meant that, in terms of some of the initial responses in the crisis that came from the Chancellor in his budget, the Scottish Government, several days on from those announcements, still weren't always entirely certain about what resource would be coming their way. So I think that the Scottish Government hasn't been afraid to respond to things differently where it's felt that is appropriate. It is announced, for example, the schools were announced they're going to close in Scotland before it happened south of the border. I think there's been an awful lot of, there's been quite a kickback to that from some political quarters. I don't think the Scottish Government has been afraid to take those decisions, and nor do I think it should be if we want to continue to be guided by the best scientific advice that we're getting. The Scottish Government has these powers. It should use them as it feels appropriate. But I think we are seeing some of the limitations of the current setup, that if, for example, there were to be a need to make more financial resources available, and the Chancellor decides to give the magic money tree a shake, as he's done a couple of times over the last month or so, sometimes we are waiting longer than we should be to find out how much is coming our way. Wouldn't it be better just to be able to take those decisions for ourselves at exactly the time they need to be taken?
Absolutely, yeah. And we did have a press release here from the Finance Secretary, Kate Forbes, just pointing out, we are going to great lengths to support businesses and are offering a package of support worth £2.2 billion, which, as promised, will commit in full all the consequentials we received from the UK government for business support measures. As you said, there's this delay, obviously, on those consequentials being
But
confirmed.
even taking it aside from the current coronavirus, there is that undercurrent in Scottish politics that you can have. You've got devolution. You can take any policy decision you like as long as it's compatible with the spending plans that taken in Westminster. And I don't think that even with the changes we've seen in the taxation powers of Holyrood and borrowing powers that has entirely gone away. But in terms of the package that is there to support businesses, a number of businesses aren't going to be paying business rates in the year ahead. I think that's exactly what's needed if you're asking people to effectively shut down their businesses. The furlough scheme announced by the Chancellor, I think, is effective as far as it goes, although there are always people being missed out on that or finding that in our MPs and MSPs postbags. I think it shows the value that there could be in having a universal basic income. That would make sure that everybody was getting enough. Instead of just trying with successive iterations to try and hit more and more marks, you were making sure right from the outset that everyone that's here is getting what they need to exist. But also in terms of the Taylor package, there is money that has gone through to support the seafood processing industry. It's of particular importance in parts of the northeast of Scotland where I represent, but that's not a package of support that's available anywhere else. So you have to be able to tailor those measures to what you see as being your own particular set of circumstances. Another difference, for example, is that airports and the ground handling facilities will be zero rated for business rates in Scotland for the next year. That's not happening anywhere else in the UK, and that's going to be absolutely vital as we try and bring the recovery socially and economically to the islands, as well as trying to kickstart that broader piece of economic recovery. So, we've got these powers. I think the Scottish Government hasn't been shy about using them where it's considered it appropriate, and nor do I think it should continue to do so in the future, as I say, where it thinks that is appropriate and where it's right. But, difference for difference sake, let's make, the whole point of wanting to have full control over our own affairs is to take the right decisions at the right time in the right interests, and not simply to take different decisions for the sake of it. It's about getting the right outcomes.
Yeah. And Alison, Richard actually segued very nicely into some of what I wanted to close on. I mean, at Easter, we're often thinking about new life, new beginnings. It's the spring anyway, so that always kind of puts those thoughts in mind. What are your hopes for after the coronavirus? Richard talked about something like UBI, which has kind of shot up the agenda in several countries just in the last few weeks. What else do you think you might like to see as a
I was just nodding away as Richard was saying UBI, and thinking back to work I was doing 15 years ago, looking at some early ideas around this and what it might look like, and taking part in schemes to live on a universal basic income myself for a while, and finding that really interesting and continuing to put that into practice. So one of my hopes would be that things that people are learning about thriftiness and about a greater simplicity in their lives, and a greater neighbourliness and community connectedness and care for one another, that these would continue, that we don't go back to normal, because normal was pretty horrible for many, many, many people. And even those who were really well off, there were elements of their lives which were really quite catastrophic. But I think for me, you mentioned Easter, and, for me, I'm a person who prays and who was raised within the Christian tradition, within the Judeo-Christian tradition. And I think for me, it's quite important that we remember that Easter was a horror show. Easter was a crucifixion. Easter was the use of a torture implement, mass torture and mass executions done by an occupying power to the Palestinian people 2,000 years ago on a jumped-up crime. This is the story we receive. And I think whether you believe it as fact or whether you live it as story, as an important narrative, it's one which has shaped the lives of many of those who are within at least three of the great religions of the book, in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And that within this understanding, hope is not fluffy bunnies. Hope is not spring flowers. Hope is hard. Hope after what is called the resurrection, and I don't rightly theologically know what resurrection is, but hope is not instant joy. Hope is found in these strange stories that we're given about somebody having companions as they are able to leave a city that's been under curfew and walk to visit friends for the first time, and is accompanied by somebody on a road, and then is able to sit at a table and break bread. Hope is somebody meeting someone on a beach who's cooking fish for them. Hope is someone who's meeting a woman in a garden and saying her name and is then imploring her not to rush to touch him. And all of these come out of a story, which is the story of Passover being celebrated in Jerusalem. And Passover, of course, was the celebration of being spared from a plague. And that was a plague that passed over on one night in Egypt, as the story goes. Here we are in confinement, where we're hoping that for many of us, this plague will pass over us. But the learning that the Israelites did and the learning that's come through those traditions is very much a learning of Sabbath, of Jubilee, of the release of prisoners, of the forgiveness of debts. And this is what we're seeing society doing by decree at the moment. We're seeing some people being released from detention. We've seen some of the early release of people who've served their sentences. We've seen the bringing in of all of these extraordinary financial measures. We've actually discovered that there really is a magic money tree, that we really can put things in place when we need to. We've discovered who the people are who we need to honour in our society, from the health workers through to the cultural workers who are helping us make our lives worth living as we are living them under confinement for many of us. Though obviously not to forget that many are living in a great deal of danger within their own homes. So I think for me, at Easter, these are the things I'm thinking of. I'm thinking that Easter was a horror show, and I'm thinking that as a result of it, people began to practice different ways of living, and some of those they sustained forward. And that in sustaining those forward, in genuinely saying, who is my neighbour and how do I show love and care for them and make sure that they're okay? How do I love them as myself? That then brings hope.
Wow. Well, thank you for that. Richard, I almost don't want to ask you to try and follow Alison there. But
I was just sitting here wondering how I would. I mean, everything that Alison has said, but just to draw out of that, I think we hopefully, if we're minded to be, we're reflective creatures by nature, and I think that out of this, we have been shown a lesson, and I hope we take it, about how fragile society sometimes can be, but also within that fragility, how strong some of the bonds are, our bonds to our family, our friends, our neighbours. We've seen how people have come together to look after each other at this time. We've seen what we value in society. We've perhaps learned that what we esteemed in the past and ways of life that we esteemed prior to the virus, perhaps those things weren't actually making us happy. Those things weren't things to strive and aspire to after all. So it gives us all an opportunity for personal reflection with this great pause that we're in at the moment about our lives, where they're going, how they impact on others, the legacy we leave. And as I say, finding, rediscovering what it is that is genuinely important to us, our families, our friendships, those round about us, the society we live in, and what kind of society we want that to be. So, as I say, those are the lessons that we have the opportunity to learn. I hope that we do. I hope that we think. I don't think that there are any easy or immediate conclusions that can be drawn from that. But that, I think, if we can take one positive from it, is that we have that opportunity. And I hope that having been given that opportunity, we use it to try and make sure that the next decades are perhaps more lived in more of the way that the last few decades perhaps ought to have been.
Yeah, well, that is all we've got time for today. I'd like to thank both of our guests. This has been a fabulous show, especially Alison's wee sermon there at the end. That was really, really touching. So thank you to both of my guests. Thank you at home for joining us as well. There wouldn't be any point in making these shows if nobody was watching them. So thank you very much for joining us. If you're able to support us here at Broadcasting Scotland, we would be very, very grateful. If you're able, please do go to broadcastingscotland.scot/register. Sign up as a supporter. Your £5 a month can make a huge difference to what we're able to do here at Broadcasting Scotland in terms of the quantity, quality, and the type of programmes that we can produce. We're already producing a nightly news show and the Full Scottish on Sundays. We're in the process of developing our afternoon show with Sam that hopefully will be up and running very, very soon. We have done a wee trial run and it is just about ready to go. So we are very much looking forward to that. In order to do some of that, though, we do have a special appeal on just now. We're trying to raise £3,000 to invest in infrastructure here, so just to make it easier for us to bring in guests for that type of show. So as I say, if you're able to help, every penny does help. If you're not able to support us financially, though, please don't feel bad about that. We do know that times are tough just now, but you can still help us by following us online. Follow us on Twitter at Broadcast Scot. Find us on Facebook as well, and then share our shows around. You're our marketing team. You're the people who get the word out about what Broadcasting Scotland is, what we do here, and what kind of shows we produce. So please do let your friends, your family, whoever you're in touch with during lockdown know that we're here. And finally, if you'd like to get involved, then there are always jobs to be done here at Broadcasting Scotland, whether that's behind the camera, as a journalist, as a camera operator, as a technician in the control room, or whether it's being on camera like me or like Sam or Gordon. There's always roles to be taken on for anyone who wants to get involved. So if you are interested in helping out here, please do get in touch. But that is, as I say, all we've got time for today. Once again, my greatest thanks to Professor Alison Phipps and to Richard Thomson, MP.
Thank you.
That's all we've got time for today. Gordon will be back tomorrow at 7 with Scotland at 7. I'll be back on Tuesday, and then I'll be back again next Sunday. But until then, I've been Kenny McBride. Have a great Easter.